was 8:13 a.m., and Daniel Foster had already decided 3 times to get out of the car, and failed every single time. The engine was off. The keys were still in the ignition. His hands rested on the steering wheel, not gripping it, not relaxed either, just there like they belonged to someone waiting for instructions that weren't coming. Outside, the parking lot looked exactly the way it always did on a Tuesday morning. A few scattered leaves dragged slowly across the asphalt. Someone in the distance laughed too loudly at something that probably wasn't that funny. A car door slammed. Life continuing. Nothing looked wrong. That was the problem. Because if something had looked wrong, if the sky had cracked open, or the building had tilted slightly off its foundation, or the world had given him any visible sign that things had shifted, he might have known how to respond to it. He might have had something to push against. But everything was intact. 12 hours earlier, he had signed the papers that ended his marriage. The moment itself had been quiet. A cheap pen, a clean line of ink, no hesitation in his hand, just a strange awareness that the name he was writing didn't feel entirely like his anymore. The woman across the table had nodded, professional, practiced. It was done. 7 years, reduced to a signature that barely took 3 seconds to complete. And now it was morning. Now there was a schedule again, a building, a desk, emails waiting to be opened, conversations waiting to be had by a version of him that was supposed to function normally. Daniel exhaled slowly, watching his breath fog faintly against the windshield before disappearing. He told himself, just 1 more minute. But the minute came, and he was still sitting there. Daniel finally moved on the 4th minute, not because he felt ready, but because staying any longer started to feel like a decision, and he wasn't sure he trusted himself to keep making those. He stepped out of the car and shut the door with more care than necessary, as if the sound might draw attention to something that wasn't visible but could somehow still be noticed. The air was cool, carrying that faint edge of early morning that hadn't yet decided what kind of day it wanted to be. Inside, the building was all glass and quiet efficiency. The lobby lights reflected cleanly off polished floors, everything arranged with the kind of precision that suggested control, something Daniel had always appreciated and something that now felt slightly out of reach. Morning, Foster. James Porter stood behind the front desk, already halfway through his first coffee, offering the same easy nod he gave every day. Nothing in his expression lingered long enough to suggest he knew anything had changed. "You look sharp." Daniel almost smiled. The line landed the way it always did, casual, automatic, unchanged. "Morning," he said, his voice steady enough to pass. The elevator ride was uneventful. 2 colleagues stepped in beside him, Olivia Grant and a newer analyst whose name hovered just out of reach in his memory. They spoke quietly about something work-related, numbers and deadlines, the kind of conversation that filled space without requiring anything personal. No one looked at him differently. No one paused. Either they didn't know, or they did and chose not to. He wasn't sure which he preferred. By the time the doors opened, Daniel had already slipped back into something familiar. Not comfort, not ease, but function. He walked to his desk, sat down, and opened his laptop. 42 unread emails. He stared at the screen without clicking a single one. At 9:05, his phone rang. Nina Wells. "Mr. Foster," she said, precise as always. "Ms. Donovan would like to see you." A pause. "Whenever you have a moment." Daniel knew what that meant. Now, the elevator ride to the top floor felt longer than it was. Daniel stood alone this time, watching the numbers climb in steady intervals, each one landing with a soft, mechanical certainty he couldn't quite relate to. There was nothing in his recent performance that explained this. No missed deadlines. No failed accounts. If anything, his work had been consistent, quietly solid. That should have been reassuring. It wasn't. The doors opened to a different kind of silence. The executive floor carried it naturally, muted, controlled, like even sound was expected to behave better up here. Nina glanced up as he approached, offering a small nod before gesturing toward the office. No questions, no commentary, just access. Daniel stepped inside. Claire Donovan stood by the window, her back to him, the city stretched out below in clean, distant lines. She didn't turn immediately. For a moment, Neither of them spoke. Then, without looking away from the glass, she said, "You signed yesterday." Not a question. Daniel felt the words settle somewhere just beneath his ribs, precise and unavoidable. "Yes," he said. A brief pause. Then she turned to face him. Claire studied him for a moment, not with curiosity, not with sympathy, just attention. The kind that suggested she had already reached a conclusion and was now confirming it. "I didn't ask for details," she said. "I don't need them." Daniel nodded once. He appreciated that more than he expected. She moved toward her desk, setting a thin folder down between them with deliberate care. "I'm assigning you the green account." He glanced at the folder, then back at her. "That account's unstable. I'm aware. It's already gone through 3 leads." "I'm aware of that too." There was no tension in her voice, no defensiveness, just fact. Daniel hesitated, then asked the only question that made sense. "Why me?" Claire held his gaze, steady, unreadable, but not distant. "Because people who have just lost something significant tend to do their best work." The answer landed harder than he expected, not because it felt harsh, but because it didn't. "They stop being careful in the wrong ways," she added. A quiet pause settled between them. Daniel looked down at the folder again, then back up. "All right," he said, and something small, almost forgotten, shifted back into place. Daniel left the executive floor with the folder tucked under his arm, the elevator doors closing quietly behind him. He stood there alone, watching his reflection blur faintly against the polished steel walls. For a moment, he didn't move. Then he looked down at the file again. The green account wasn't just difficult, it was layered. Notes stacked over notes. Strategies that almost worked, then didn't. Feedback that contradicted itself, depending on when it was given and who was listening. It wasn't chaos exactly. It was something more frustrating than that. Something that looked like structure until you tried to follow it. Daniel spent the next 3 days inside it. He read everything. Slowly at first, then with more intent. He made notes in the margins, crossing out assumptions, circling patterns that didn't quite fit. By Wednesday afternoon, he called Thomas Green directly. The conversation lasted 40 minutes. Daniel asked questions that didn't soften themselves on the way out. Clear, direct, uncomfortable in the way that required real answers. There were pauses on the other end of the line, brief but noticeable. Daniel recognized them for what they were. Not resistance, interest. By the time the call ended, he had something he hadn't seen in the file before. A direction. Daniel worked through the weekend. Not out of urgency, not even out of pressure, just focus. The kind that settles in when distractions stop asking for attention. Emma sat across from him at the kitchen table, a nature documentary playing softly in the background. She had a notebook open, occasionally glancing up at the screen, then back down to write something with careful concentration. "Did you know," she said without looking up, "that baby penguins make a sound so their parents can find them?" Daniel paused, fingers resting lightly on the keyboard. "Every single one sounds different." She nodded, serious. "So they don't get mixed up." He leaned back slightly, considering that. "That's pretty incredible." "I think so too," she said, then returned to her notes as if the matter had been properly acknowledged. He went back to the proposal. It came together faster than he expected. Not because it was easy, but because it was clear, the noise stripped away. The contradictions resolved into something more direct, more honest than what had been there before. By Monday morning, it was done. He submitted it without rereading it again. That afternoon, Nina called. "Ms. Donovan would like to see you." Daniel closed his laptop slowly. Round 2. Claire had the proposal open when he walked in. She didn't look up immediately, just turned a page, then another, her expression unchanged, giving nothing away. The room stayed quiet long enough for Daniel to become aware of the sound of his own breathing again. Steady, controlled, deliberate. Finally, she stopped. "You told him his Q3 strategy was backward." Daniel didn't hesitate. "It is." A brief pause. "He doesn't respond well to criticism. He doesn't respond well to agreement either," Daniel said. "That's why the last 3 leads failed." Claire lifted her eyes to meet his. Not sharp, not challenging, just recalibrating. "He wants someone who pushes back," Daniel added. "Someone who has a position of their own." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was evaluative. Then, almost imperceptibly, something shifted in her expression. Not approval. Not quite. But close enough to recognize. "All right," she said. She closed the folder. "It's approved." Daniel nodded once. No visible reaction. No release of tension. But something inside him settled into place. As he turned to leave, Claire spoke again. "The meeting with Green is Thursday." "I know." A faint pause. "Good," she said. The meeting with Thomas Green went better than expected. Not smoothly. Smooth would have meant predictable, and Green wasn't predictable, but controlled in a way that mattered more. Within the first 10 minutes, Green tried twice to steer the conversation away from Daniel's framework. Both times, Daniel redirected it without raising his voice, without forcing it, just steady, deliberate course correction. Green noticed. Daniel could see it in the way the interruptions slowed, in the way the questions shifted from dismissive to measured. By the end of the meeting, Green leaned back slightly, studying him with something that hadn't been there before. "Interest. We'll continue this," Green said, extending his hand. It wasn't approval, but it wasn't rejection either. For this account, that was enough. Back at the office, Daniel gathered his team, Maya, Ben, and Susan, walking them through the adjusted direction. They listened closely, asking questions where it mattered, refining where needed. It felt functional. Not perfect, not complete, but moving. Later that afternoon, Claire passed by his section of the floor. She didn't stop, didn't speak, just a brief glance in his direction, quick enough to miss unless you were paying attention. Daniel was. Over the next 2 weeks, Daniel began to notice things he hadn't paid attention to before. Not changes exactly, more like details that had always been there, waiting to be seen. Claire moved through the building quietly, but nothing escaped her. A junior analyst who had been struggling was reassigned before anyone else seemed to register it. A new hire who delivered exceptional work found herself pulled into higher-level meetings within days. There were no announcements, no visible decisions being made, just outcomes appearing where they were needed. It wasn't control in the obvious sense. It was awareness. And once Daniel saw it, he couldn't unsee it. He also became aware of something else. She noticed him, not in ways that drew attention. No direct conversations, no unnecessary interactions. Just small, precise moments, a glance during a meeting, a pause half a second longer than required when he spoke, a quiet recognition that didn't need to be acknowledged to exist. It wasn't frequent, but it was consistent. One afternoon, she stopped at the edge of his desk. "The Green meeting is Thursday," she said. "I know." A brief pause. "Do you want a prep session?" Daniel looked up at her. "Do I need one?" Something almost like amusement touched her expression. "No," she said, and walked away. If this story stayed with you, tap the like button, subscribe so you don't miss what comes next, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from.